think back to the time we were at Indiana University together as professors in the history department there. So it's especially a treat for me to see how, just to honor seeing her career arc so high and so sharp, and to be here with her latest production. Let's jump right in. Why this book, Professor Myers? What was the inspiration for the topic? And if you would say something about your first book, Forging Freedom, which whether or not this is the daughter of that book, or it's the niece or long lost relative, how the connectedness of the first two books, but especially the inspiration behind this second.
I think those two questions are actually really connected. So thank you so much, Professor Clegg, for the question, and thank you for being here this evening. It's wonderful to be up here with you. So my first book was called Forging Freedom, Black Women in the Pursuit of Liberty in Antebellum Charleston. And in a nutshell, it examines what does it mean to be a Black woman who's free in the Old South. How free is free when you are a Black woman? Are you really equal to white folks? Do you have the same opportunities and advantages that white men do, that white women do, that Black men do? So how does race and gender come together to provide pathways or opportunities, but also to constrain and put up obstacles? And really, that book sort of showed all of the constant negotiations that Black women had to engage in to be able to not just get free, but stay free. Because it wasn't just a one-time deal of acquiring manumission, it was actually a constant daily battle to stay free, because the system wasn't set up for Black people to be free. You know, by the 19th century in the South, the theory is Black equals enslaved, white equals free. And so free Black is an oxymoron, right? It's a paradox that doesn't make sense. And so on the one hand, you have white folks who are creating pathways to freedom for Black people, but on the other hand, they're setting up all kinds of barriers and roadblocks. If you don't pay your taxes, you're going to be re-enslaved. You know, if you don't, if you break the law, instead of paying a fine, you're going to be re-enslaved if you're a Black person. And Black people have extra taxes on them, all kinds of things like that. So it's really, it's a book that really engages with all of the tactics of negotiation that Black women have to enter into to create freer and fuller lives for themselves, but also for their children and for their families. Because most of these women, what they're really able to do is create pathways to stronger, more permanent freedom for their descendants, for their children, for their grandchildren. So even if it's not so, as wide of a freedom for themselves, it's always about looking to the future for what they can do for their descendants. And the last two chapters of that first book, I actually do case studies on individual women and their families over 2 or 3 or 4 generations. We know that in the 18th and 19th centuries, it's very difficult to find enough records or enough materials to write an entire book on one woman and her family, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. But I was fortunate enough in that first book to be able to, as I spent time in South Carolina digging through the archives, looking at legal cases, court transcripts, family records, all kinds of newspapers and other kinds of materials, I was able to cobble together enough material on 2 particular women and their families to actually do 2 standalone chapters. And as I was writing those chapters, and it really brought the earlier chapters that talked about manumission and labor and education and community building, it brought those chapters to life in such an amazing way, because you could see the topical working out in the personal. You could see it unfolding in the lives of these real women. And I thought to myself, I would love to be able to write a whole book like this, a whole book on Sarah Sanders, Sarah Sanders or Margaret Bettingall, the women who I write about in those final 2 chapters of the first book. It would be amazing to be able to really dig into one woman, one family, and show what it was like to be a Black woman in the slave South, and be able to, what does privilege really look like? What does power look like? What does those tactics of negotiation look like? Do they work? Where are the lines drawn? You know, where do white people say, past this fence you cannot go, right? Nationally, locally, what are the differences? How are mixed race children treated? Are they accepted, right? Are their mothers actually able to acquire more freedom and power and privilege for them, which is what they're hoping for? More property, more education. And then, so I'm finishing up Forging Freedom, which is also a UNC Press book. And as it's coming to fruition and coming out, I'm working on putting together my lecture materials for the US survey, part 1. You know, basic freshman level, you know, from contact to Reconstruction. And I come across a little itty bitty tiny paragraph on a vice president named Richard Mentor Johnson, and it was just this throwaway paragraph on Johnson and his concubines. I mean, literally, right? You know, this man was a travesty. He had like all these enslaved mistresses. You know, the abolitionists used him as an example for why slavery should be abolished, because look at these Southern politicians who abused slave women but kept getting elected to public office. And I thought to myself, hold up, how come I've never heard of this man or these women that he supposedly was involved with? And so I said, well, let me put a pin in it because I have to finish Forging Freedom first. But then when I actually started to do the deeper investigation, I literally fell down the proverbial rabbit hole. And I realized, you know, so this is, you know, it's been 12 years, right, since I found that little paragraph and started thinking about Julia and Richard and their daughters. But it really is that, you know, sort of springboard from that first book, because I couldn't write an entire book on Barbara Barquette, Margaret Bettingall, who I talk about in the last chapter of Forging Freedom, or Sarah Sanders and her children, who are in the second last chapter. But that's the kind of story I wanted to write. I wanted to write an entire book, but I also wanted it to be more public facing. I wanted it to be the kind of book that was accessible to a broad audience, something that was deeply researched, that our colleagues would be able to look up the materials, the archival sources, the references, but something that was written so that somebody like my father, who is really well, you know, who loves history, could pick up and read. Because I remember my dad telling me that he tried to read Forging Freedom and he didn't make it past page 7. And I was like, but I thought that was a really well-written, accessible book, you know. And that's when I realized that, you know, Forging Freedom, for all of its wonderful, I mean, it's a wonderful book and I love it. It was my first book. I will always love it, but it's written in a much more academic style, and it was written, you know, for a purpose. It was my first book. It was revised out of my dissertation, and it was my tenure book, right, as we call it. This is a very different book, and so it's in many ways the daughter of the first book, but in other ways it's wildly different because of methodology and sources and writing style. And so I think that if you've read the first book, you can see the continuation in some ways, but it's also its own very own person. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And actually, although you don't know the script or my questions ahead of time, you anticipate actually some of the things that I want to ask you about. Setting the historical scene. Okay. Take us to what it was like to be in early 19th century Kentucky or the U.S. What's the one or two most important things going on in the country, early 19th century, that relate directly to your story? So it's a big question, but if you could pinpoint, you know, one or two things that are going on, whether in the state or more broadly in the U.S., that you say, okay, this and maybe this are at the foundations of the story I want to tell.
So we don't know exactly when Julia was born, but we know that she was born at some point in the mid to late 1790s. This is actually really critical because this is when the quote-unquote West is being opened up for exploration and expansion in the United States. And the West at that point, we're talking Kentucky and we're talking Tennessee. This is, I mean, Richard is born in 1780, right? So do the math. There's quite a large age difference. I'm sure people are already going, hang on a second, how, what? Yeah, there's a large age difference. Richard's parents are actually among the first settlers to arrive into the Kentucky territory, which is carved out of Virginia. They're from Virginia. They are, right there at the forefront, helping to settle this new Western territory. They helped to found one of the most important, oldest, and still existing Baptist churches in the state. Robert Johnson, that's Richard's father, is a surveyor of the territory. He will sign the territorial constitution. He will sign the eventual state constitution. The Johnsons are one of the literal and figurative first families of Kentucky. They not only are the first to arrive and settle, but they will become one of the wealthiest, most powerful families in the state, helping to shape the legal aspects, the economic aspects. Because of Robert's position as a surveyor, he and his extended kin and his sons will basically end up owning tens of thousands of acres of the most prime land in what will become the state of Kentucky. This is not a working class or even a middling well-to-do family. These are folks who hobnob with, right, the Henry Clays and the Thomas Jeffersons, and right, these are the folks we're talking about. Like, they come out of Virginia, right, and we know that four of the first presidents, right, come from Virginia. These are the people we're talking about. So this is the time period we're talking about. We're talking about the 1790s. We're talking about the fact that we've just really come out of the Revolutionary era. This is the early Republic. This is when Western expansion is just starting, but we're not talking California. We're talking Kentucky, and Kentucky is the frontier. Tennessee is the frontier, and this is Daniel Boone territory, right? That's where Kentucky and Daniel Boone. I mean, these folks know Daniel Boone, right? There's a member of the family back then whose middle name is Boone, actually, literally. So that's what's going on in the larger country, and this is the story that takes place in Kentucky, because these are folks who are coming out on that, Western migration to settle the West, as the revolution comes to a close and the West is open for expansion. So I think it really is important to consider. Richard is born in what is today Louisville, Kentucky, but it was not even called Louisville at that point. It was called Beargrass. It wasn't even conceived of as Louisville, Kentucky, right? His mother, Jemima Suggett Johnson, there's stories of her, there's constant stories and references of Native American attacks, right? And the settlers banding together and fending off the vicious and violent Native Americans, and Jemima Suggett Johnson, valiantly helping to defend the fort and the family and going out to get water despite the attacks from Native Americans. So this is the kind of scenario in which the Johnson saga unfolds, the Robert Johnsons and then Richard, and this is the family into which Harriet, Julia's mother, is enslaved. And this is the family into which Julia is born. She is enslaved by Robert and Jemima Suggett Johnson. I think that's really that era of expansion and Native American conflict. This is going to come to define Richard's life, and it will absolutely come to define Julia's.
You mentioned, Professor Myers, earlier, archives.
Yes.
And to read this work, to a certain extent, her first work, but this work in particular is part detective story by necessity. The fact that the sources are spotty in places, as you're mentioning, there are silences. One phrase you used in regard to the archives is they were violent places, which I'd like to certainly hear more about. Would you say more about the notion, the nature of archives, like any good historian who's trying to do work on people who did not leave much in the way of documentation, you've had to build your own archive to a certain degree. You had to piece things together, newspaper articles and diaries and letters and things that you, and then you've had to deal with the silences, what's not there, and try to figure out what does what not there say about what is there. And I don't know, perhaps to put it in its most candid or crude way, what we're left with in these violent spaces, as you call them, these are more or less the archives and repositories of the perpetrators. That is what they have chosen to leave us and what they want us to see. Okay.
Yeah, I call it the settler colonial archive.
Okay.
I mean, I'm just, that's what it is.
It is what it is.
It is what it is.
Yes. So, with that as the backdrop, it makes your story, the story of your time in the archives, a much more interesting one, because you're not there to see what they left for you to see. That is, you need to see something between the lines, in the silences, under the carpet, and so forth. It's made even harder by, I think you mentioning Richard Johnson's, his brothers, destroying the records, right? So
we're almost positive at this point that they did, because here's a man who was in national politics for 45 years, and there's no archive of his letters, of his papers, of his records, not in Washington, D.C., not in Kentucky. 45 years as a politician, and the LOC in D.C. only has one tiny collection of about 100 of letters, which were its business correspondence. And Julia and her daughters were literate, and they were writing letters back and forth to Richard all those years that he lived in, because he lived in D.C. for 6 months of every year. He references those letters in his own. They're nowhere to be found.
So
yeah, which I still, it's a gut punch every time I think about it. Yeah.
So just, let's start from there.
Yeah.
Where does that leave the historian who needs to tell the story, who successfully excavates this woman, her two children, and others, and so forth? How did you, I guess in sort of layperson's terms, someone like your father might be able to follow, or someone who's not a historian? How do you get from settler colonial archives, the violent spaces of the archives, the tyranny of the archives that have been erased by players in the story, destroyed and so forth, to a full-blown, wonderfully researched, argued, compelling, cogent study of these lives? How do you get from, again, that pretty bad space of point A with all the problems that you faced, to
a book,
to an actual book about people that we were not actually supposed to know about?
Right.
If it was up to the vice president, his brothers, and others who decided they were just going to give the national or the Library of Congress 100 pages from a guy who was the vice president of the United States.
Yeah.
How did you find these folks? How do you flesh them out? How do you pull them out of the settler colonial archives and give voice to them and give some agency to them, make them complicated, fully blown people the way that you actually do in the book?
I'm really glad you asked me that question, because that's where I think that this book is in some ways very different from my first book. I mean, it is still very deeply researched in the archive. And for all the problems of the archives are still spaces that historians love, right? We all grew up loving books and loving libraries and loving bookstores, and we have a love-hate relationship with the archive in the sense that we love to be in those spaces, looking at the records. We may not necessarily love microfilm, but we love to look at the records, to look at the handwriting, right? To see someone's name show up in a census record, or to find them in a will or in a tax book. It gives you chills, right? It's absolutely, I can't even describe the feeling. But there's also this incredible sadness and tension and anger when you realize the really, really concerted effort that went into keeping certain people out of those spaces. that the archives were built, I call them the settler colonial archive for a reason, right? That the archives were built by white men for white men. They weren't even meant to hold white women's stories, right? They weren't meant to hold indigenous people's stories or records. They weren't meant to hold the narratives and voices of people of African descent. They were, or even impoverished white folks. These were really, right, wealthy white men who were creating spaces to house their records, right? Colonial records of large corporations like the East India Company, right? State government records, official documents and correspondence, and then the wills and estate papers of wealthy individuals who were literate and who had money and power. You were not supposed to, it was irrelevant to think about going into a space like that and asking for records or materials about indigenous people or enslaved Africans. I still remember walking into the South Carolina Department of Archives and History many a year ago now when I was still a graduate student and, saying, I really want to find records on free Black women in Charleston, South Carolina. And the library and the archival staff looking at me going, I don't know how, I don't think we have anything. And of course they did, but it was about how you access those records because they're not neatly in boxes labeled free Black people, free Black women, Black people here, like look, it's not that easy, it's not that simple. And when I started researching and writing this book, I thought this will be simpler. 45 years in politics, there will be a library dedicated to him. There will be dozens of boxes. I will be drowning in records and materials. Little did I know. So I went back to the tools that I had already engaged in my first book. I used, the chapters really each try to draw on as much written documentation as does exist in the traditional settler colonial archive. So that means that the first couple of chapters really draw on Richard's letters to other people. So whatever letters that he wrote to other white men that exist in the country, which are scattered all over the country. Some are in Washington, some are in Kentucky, some are in Kansas, some are, because he was writing to politicians like Henry Clay or Thomas Jefferson or Madison or whoever Martin Van Buren, who he was VP for. And so you have to go and look at those men's records to find the one or two or three letters that they may have salvaged that Johnson wrote to them. So the letters that I've been able to find that Johnson wrote to other people, particularly a collection at the Filson Archives, Thomas Henderson's papers. Henderson would end up he was a Baptist minister, he had known the Johnsons for a long time, and he and Richard and Julia would have a long-standing relationship because of an indigenous boarding school that was on the Richard and Julia's property called Choctaw Academy. And so because of that, Richard and Thomas wrote back and forth to each other a long time. Thomas's letters to Richard, of course, don't exist, but Richard's letters to Thomas, a number of them have survived because Thomas Henderson's family donated his records to the Filson. So those letters, those papers help those first 2-3 chapters really flesh out. The chapter on the church, I use Great Crossing Baptist Church, I use the church parish registers, which date all the way back from just 8 years after its founding in the 1790s, which is amazing. But then what I really had to do after that chapter is I really had to look at newspaper records for the back half of the book, chapters 5 and 6, to really look at local and national newspapers and how people were talking about the Johnsons, how they were talking about Julia and her daughters. And then the last chapter, I use a lot of materials from descendants, because the descendants of the family who I was able to meet and interview opened up their archives to me. But I realized very quickly that I couldn't just write a book about Julia that got to the heart of who she was by using the traditional written records. If I had done that, this would be a very poor history, in my opinion. And so I was like, I have to go beyond the walls of the settler colonial archive. So what does that mean? I went to the land where she lived. I took photographs of the spaces where she worshipped. I went to the church. I went to the graveyards, right? I went literally to these spaces where she would have lived, where she would have worked and laughed and loved and died. And so there's a lot of my own photographs that I took are in the book. I met with descendants. I was honored to be able to interview a half dozen of them, and their interviews are in the introduction and in the conclusion to the book, which I think is critical, because we have to talk not just about the past, but about the present, and about erasure, and about why nobody knows who Julia Chin is, right? And I think that this book is not just about the 200 years ago, but it's very much a commentary and very telling about this present moment. So I don't think that these are things I would have been willing to do just coming out of graduate school, when, you're sort of told, there's only one kind of source that historians use. But this is the kind of work that anthropologists and geographers and others have been doing for a long time. And so I said, well, yes, I'm going to interrogate the silence. I'm going to say, well, what is it that we learn from what isn't said and what's missing? Because I'm a historical private detective and I have a 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, and I really only have 500 pieces. And I have to start to fill in those gaps. But it also meant being much more broad about the word source, and understanding that it means gravestones, and it means the land, and it means buildings and spaces, and it means poetry, and it means using fiction and literature. It means using photographs, right, and a much wider array of materials, because if we just limit ourselves to that white archive that only wanted us to learn certain things about certain groups of people, then we really would be in a position to believe it when people say to us, you can't write that book, there isn't enough material. And there were a lot of people who said that to me. You can't write that book, there aren't enough sources, there aren't enough sources, how are you gonna write that book? And I said, watch me. And it took me a minute, but I did it, because yes, you can if you're willing to think outside of those traditional boxes and spaces.
The relationship itself, or however we might want to think about it. You choose to use the word wife. It's in the title, Vice President's Black Wife, and you actually up front, you know that this is a problematic way of characterizing it. And up front, you take a lot of things head on up front, which I think is refreshing. You don't dodge anything. But one of the things was up front. Okay, I'm gonna use this word wife. I'm gonna unpack it. What it means to this story. And I think I was skeptical at first. I was like, okay, how's my good friend and colleague Amrita gonna pull this off, Professor Myers? And she pulls it off, right? But she complicates and she problematizes the use of wife in ways that I think a very sensitive historian would do in regard to the circumstances. You also have to problematize other things. Consent. That is choice. Love. What can you have that? Could you have any sort of healthy relationship in which the power dynamics are so uneven? You have master and enslaved. Can you have a wife? Can you have a marriage when the law itself doesn't recognize that? And you I think compel your reader. You invite your reader to think more broadly about the term wife matrimony by pointing to enslaved people who legally could not marry, but they thought to themselves as being married, and perhaps that's more powerful than any piece of paper with the law would be able to endow their relationships with. So you can go in any direction you want to with this, but one direction I'd like to see you go in is the choice to think of them as married. Even Johnson referred to this as my wife. So your choice to think of them as married, and what that means in that context of, sort of, well, it was illegal by the state assessment of what could and could not happen. So what it means to your story to present her as wife and this as a marriage? And then what sort of complications, notions of consent, choice, fact if things go sideways, she can't just leave. I don't think she could have. The law would not have been on her side if she tried to divorce him by separating and so
Which
forth.
is where we have to talk about coercion.
Right. So, in that realm of ideas about what could and could not happen, and again, we're compelled to think speculatively about some of this because we don't know the nature of their love. We do know that his relationship with his daughters, Imogen and Adeline, that appears to have been a sort of parental, fatherly love, which perhaps, according to your book and my reading of your book, is a bit more easily documented than his feelings, wherever they might be, in regard to Julia Chin. So your choice to think of this as a marriage, her as wife, and your proof of that choice, and I think you have a number of ways, the way in which you manage things. He presented her into public, which was part of his undoing as well. But also the issues of consent and coercion and choice and so forth. How that maybe complicates this notion that that this is a marriage or she is a wife. Although, of course, the other side of that is there are many marriages confirmed by the church and so forth in which the power dynamic is off between, especially in the 19th century, between men and women.
Absolutely.
So I'll just set that there and see how you process it. She processes it really well in the book, I'll tell you that.
Big question.
It is. Just take a piece of it which you're comfortable with or you think we get the most knowledge out of.
No, it's fine because I knew that calling her wife was going to be a topic of conversation. And I knew that the title of the book would also therefore be a topic of conversation. And so it's not a question that I'm not prepared for. And there's a reason that I address it right up front in the section on terminology. I tell my students all the time, whatever you're doing and not doing, say it up front. Whether people agree with you or not, at least you're making them aware up front of what book you are writing and what book you are not writing, what you are doing and what you're not doing, and then move forward from there. Rather than having people come back and complain later that you didn't say this, or you didn't do this, and whatever. And so hopefully I lived up to my own advice to my students. But one of the things that I think we have to be very careful about in terms of this term marriage, I think that from our 21st century perspective, we have this notion of marriage as being companionate, romantic, right? Based on choice between people, individuals. In the late 1700s and well into the 1800s, marriage, even between white persons, did not look that way. It was not about romance, it was not about love. This idea of companionate marriage that we now function under was still yet to be fully formed and come into being. Marriages were determined by parents and families, and they were organized in order to consolidate land and political power and wealth. Young girls were married off to much older men because women were prized for their fertility and reproductive bearing, years of reproductive capabilities. Men were prized for their wealth, for the fact that they were already stable and had land and enslaved laborers in the South and all of these other things. So it was not uncommon to see a 15 or 16-year-old young white girl be married off in an arranged situation with a gentleman in his 30s or even 40s if it was his second marriage and his first wife had died in childbed. Very common. That being so, when we're talking about choice or even consent or coercion, how many young white women necessarily had that when it comes to what their parents and grandparents and uncles, because it was the men of the family especially who were making these contractual arrangements and coming up with trust accounts and agreements, right, for their daughters and grandchildren in these situations. The second thing is, I think that if we only considered a marriage to be a marriage when there was a piece of paper involved, that would actually let out a lot of working class folks of all different racial backgrounds. There were lots of people who simply took up together, as they called it back in the day, particularly people who were of the servant class, working classes, poor folks, Irish, poor Irish folks. Martha Hodes writes about this quite brilliantly in her first book. Common law marriage was actually accepted as marriage in many states in the US, including South Carolina, where I wrote about it in my first book. And it was in fact legitimized by the courts if people had lived together for more than 3 decades in South Carolina. So to just willy-nilly toss out any relationship that wasn't legalized by the courts or the church is to me being, kind of short-sighted in terms of, therefore, again, privileging who? The upper classes who have the money and the literacy to go to the courthouse or have a church wedding, pay for a priest, pay to have their marriage notarized and the deeds filed. All of that was costly. It cost money to have a marriage, to get a marriage license and to file, right, your marriage and to go through all of those steps, which is why most poor and working class people just took up together, right? So I think that we have to sort of think about this not from a 21st century perspective of 1, romance, and 2, legality, right? And I really like the work that Tara Hunter has done in her recent book on marriage amongst Black people and understanding that, right, how Black folks internally in the 18th and 19th centuries positioned themselves into the institution of marriage and thought about marriage was not the same as how white people looked at and thought about marriage, partly out of necessity because of the institution of slavery and structural racism, right? Just because enslaved people's marriages were not viewed by the state as legal marriages didn't mean that Black persons did not see themselves as married to one another and partnered for life. And we know that actually once the Civil War came and went and Black people could sort of legalize those marriages, many of them chose to do so. They had already been together for 10, 20, 30 years, but they went to those courthouses and they went to those churches and they had those marriages solemnized when they were allowed to do so. So thinking about the work that Hunter has done on the different kinds of families that Black people put together, the different way we think about things like kin and kinship inside, the African American community, thinking about romance and all of these things, and then adding in the fact that Richard Johnson more than once referred to Julia as his wife. How would I not refer to her as his wife, especially when you consider the labor that she performed for this man every single day for 23 years until she died? Because wifehood is very much about labor. It's about running a household. It's about literally labor in terms of birthing children. It's about overseeing those children. It's about doing the day-to-day tasks in the household, on the farm. It is about the 1,001 things that you have to do to run a home and a business. And Julia did all of this and more. Richard was gone for 6 months every year because he was a politician. He was a full-time politician, so he lived in DC. And then he was home for 6 months of the year in Kentucky. So who ran that 2,000-acre plantation, Blue Spring Farm? Who oversaw the almost 100 enslaved laborers? Who had access to the lines of credit? Who dealt with all the storekeepers in town? Who signed all the contracts for everything that the household needed to survive? Who raised the children and made sure that they were educated? It was Julia who did all of these things. And on top of that, she entertained the Marquis de Lafayette, James Madison, and others who happened to jump in for soirees ranging from 30 to 300 or more on a given, on a moment's notice. There is nothing that this woman did not do that a wife, right, the mistress of the house, would not be expected to do on a daily basis, entertaining family members of Richard's who would come to visit and stay for weeks or months at a time. Richard's sister Sally and her husband William, so sister and brother-in-law, lived with Julia and Richard for years until they moved to Oklahoma Territory when William became the Indian agent to the Cherokee and Choctaw nations after Indian removal. So here's a woman who literally is like, well, I'm doing all the work of a wife, right? I'm bearing the children like a wife. I'm running this farm like a wife, because this is a business. This farm is a business, right? There's also grist mills and sawmills. There's a tavern. So she's overseeing all of this. She's writing letters back and forth. I'm not calling her a concubine or a mistress. That's insulting. She's a wife. She does the work of a wife. She gets called a wife. Does that get to the heart of the question?
I'm convinced. I was convinced in advance.
No, but yeah. I mean, I hope that actually answers the question, because I think it's a really important question. But I had to look at it from all these angles, because it's not just because he refers to her as his wife. It's not about love and romance, because not only do we not really know how he feels about her, we do not know how she feels about him. We don't have any of her existing letters. I can analyze her behavior and her actions, but I don't know how she felt about him. And so, as I have told people, this is not a love story. This is not a Harlequin romance. I am a historian. And there's only but so far I can go in terms of, doing what I call informed speculation. I am not trying to figure out whether or not Julia loved Richard. I know Julia loved her daughters, because I can tell by the sacrifices she made to make sure that her children would have a better life than the one she did. She was never free. Her daughters were. She never had a formal education, although she was literate. Her daughters did. She never owned thousands of acres of property and enslaved laborers. Both of her daughters would go on to do so. In every respect, she built a wider doorway and a pathway forward for her descendants than she ever had for herself. So,
2 questions. I'll ask you to zoom out that lens.
Yeah.
So you've zoomed it in really close and looked at the particulars.
Yes.
As far as we can understand the particulars of their relationship, their marriage, and so forth. Zoom it out, your lens, the 10,000-foot level. What do the lives of people like Julia Chin, her daughters, is it Parthene, the woman that comes after Julia?
Julia's niece.
Okay.
Parthene, yes.
Their lives as lenses or optics for understanding something deeper about this history. How are they best used, their lives? You give them as fully fleshed out as sources will allow, as anybody can do. Okay. Zooming out from what you've done, what's the bigger payoff for knowing about these women in terms of U.S. history or African American history or women's history? And we academics often cheat like this, usually at conferences. That is, we say we're going to ask one question, we actually ask about 3 of them. Mm-hmm. But I'm just going to ask the second one. It's related to this one. Allow me this particular conceit.
Of course.
And it's related to how you take it on the book too. So, aside from the sort of labor that the book does, your protagonist and the people around her do for a better, deeper understanding of history. Say something about the labor the book does there, and the labor of the book in this historical moment that we're in, which you take on in a sort of refreshing way up front. There are those, as you talk about in the book, who don't think this is really serious stuff. What you and I do is serious. African American history, African American studies, women's gender.
Or they think it's so serious that they're censoring and banning it in certain places.
Exactly. So, another fascinating thing about this movement, or about this moment, is that we have a Black woman who is a vice president, following an African American man who was president. So in this moment in which you're Kamala Harris is the new Richard Johnson, right? And she
from
is
the enslaved wife of a vice president to a vice president.
Yes, who is a
right,
an 80-year-old heartbeat away from the presidency, right?
Correct.
Now
that's one way to put it.
Oh yeah. Well,
I mean, let's be bold.
81 next month. Right?
Let's be bold.
Oh yeah.
Right.
So from there to there, and this book being written in a time of a female Black / South Asian woman in that seat that he was in. But again, in the context
something I was quite aware of as I was writing that introduction.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you're able to, a number of things you capture in the introduction that within your recent, last several months. But also in this moment in which there are those who want to ban, if not burn books. They're saying this is not really stuff that, the litmus test is, if it offends some student in the room, or if it offends larger, it shouldn't be taught. Okay?
Yeah.
So the labor that the book does in terms of history as a discipline and history as a way of knowing and seeing, and then the kind of labor that you would like for the book to be doing in a broader societal sense when there are people who are questioning the study of history. And certainly, questioning, we have a governor whose name rhymes with Ron DeSantis, who said that, that there are benefits. People like Julia Chin, there's some benefits that she got from being enslaved and so forth, that she could take into freedom and so forth. So as a product of a serious historian writing this history, what do you want us to take away from it by looking at these particular lives? And as a historical artifact in this particular societal moment where, again, you have a vice president who's a Black woman, and then you have this larger movement that would erase not only her, it would erase any talk of slavery and enslavement from the public schools and so forth. What kind of labor does do you see your book best doing in that particular moment?
So neither one of these are small questions.
No, and you probably need to pick and choose which one you want to tackle to give the audience a few moments. But I see the book's importance in both realms. Sort of the typical pushing our understanding of a historical subject down the field further.
Right.
And then, but this is one that in this particular historical moment, societal moment, resonates. Perhaps that would be the
I think so. I want to take that second question that you asked me about the particular moment, because one of the things that I think that the book does, or that I'm hoping it does, is really addresses erasure, right? And the dangers of erasure, the power of erasure, and historical memory, history and memory, right? Who gets to decide what's written? Who gets to decide what's read? Who gets to decide what goes into the quote-unquote master narrative of American history? If you look globally, long scope, as historians tend to do, backwards, we see that every society that has descended into fascist chaos has done a couple of things as they step their way into into that complete state of control. The first thing that they actually do is take control of the free press, because they have to make sure that the only ideas that are getting out are state approved, party approved. So journalists will find themselves thrown into prisons or camps. Right alongside of that, almost simultaneously, is takeover of the school system. And not just the K through 12 system, but universities. And if you look at countries historically that have ended up in fascist chaos, University professors are arrested, they are fired, they are jailed, they end up in labor camps and concentration camps alongside other folks. K through 12 curricula is rewritten. Teachers are put in who are willing to follow that curricula that's set by the state agenda and not deviate from it. They are given a preset list of books. They are given a preset list of modules that they can teach, and they cannot deviate from it. Censorship is in the press, but censorship is also in the classroom, and any books that deviate from the norm and that offend the state and that call the state mythstery instead of history into question are pulled into the public squares and burned. If any of this sounds vaguely familiar in terms of what is happening today, we should all be terrified. I know I am. Right? People laughingly have said to me, oh, your book's probably going to be banned in certain places. I said, probably, but that's not something to laugh about. Setting that context, this book is about memory and erasure, both nationally and personally for the family involved. As I mentioned, it's almost certain that Richard's two surviving white brothers destroyed his papers after he died. He died without a will, they said, and they went to court to have him declared dead. They went to probate court. And they also said at that time that they were his only living relatives, that he had no children or other descendants living, in order to take control of whatever property he had left to him. Now, this was a bald-faced lie right there in Scott County, Kentucky, where the probate judge knew that Imogene was living right up the road with her husband and her 6 kids. Adeline, by this point, had passed away, but she had passed away having already given birth to a son who was alive and well. So there were clearly descendants, but these brothers wanted to make absolutely sure that Imogene and Adeline and their children were not only disinherited, but erased from the public record, no children or descendants living. Then poof, 40 years of records just vanish into the, letters, business, everything. Just, where are all these records? Or where are the letters from Adeline, Imogene, Julia? They're nowhere to be found. They were mortified that their brother, son, nephew, uncle had such an unconventional life and an unconventional wife, right? As I like to put it. Had he married a white woman, they certainly would not have done this. Had he married a white woman and had a black woman in the quarters, hidden on the side like Henry Clay did, who lived just up the road, or Thomas Jefferson did. Thomas Jefferson waited until his white wife passed away, but he didn't openly refer to Sally Hemings as his wife or his partner. He didn't openly acknowledge their children. Hemings wasn't entertaining at Monticello when presidents came to visit. These are men, the Governor Poindexter of Mississippi, others, huge political names who have these relationships, but they're all hidden, right? They're open secrets. Everybody knows about it and whispers about it at cocktail parties and pillow talk. But these are men who are still revered and written about and talked about and remembered because they lied, right? They lied, and that was cool because it was about the public face you maintained. You could do whatever you chose in private as long as you maintained the public face of, white wife, white family, public servant figure, adhering to what I call the racial playbook, right? Of the second interracial sexual playbook of society. It's not that you couldn't have the sex, it's just that you couldn't be open about it, right? You couldn't talk about it. Johnson and Chin, of course, that crosses all those lines, it crosses all of those boundaries, and his family is mortified. His parents, right, his mother especially, from the oral histories that we've gathered, his mother is mortified. Clearly some of his brothers are upset about it, other nephews and kin. And so when he passes away, they make every effort to disinherit, to erase, to get rid of these women's lives, their existence. And to a certain extent, they're able to do that. But what they can't do is they can't get rid of Richard's letters to other people. They can't get rid of the church records, the Great Crossing registers. They can't get rid of all the newspaper articles that have been written for decades on Julia and her daughters and the family, good and bad articles, right, nationally and locally. There are so many things. They can't get rid of census materials. Like the stuff that we social historians like go through, right, with fine-tooth combs, the wills and estate records, the taxes, the land deeds, the mortgages, the census materials, they can't get rid of any of those things. I mean, there were several fires in the county courthouse that helped these brothers out, right? But there's just too much material that they can't get rid of, but what they can, they do. And what that sets up is a scenario that within the nation, nationally, Johnson is quietly forgotten about because he's an embarrassment, right? Julia and her children are an embarrassment. And so by the turn of the century into the 20th century, people have forgotten this unconventional vice president and his very unconventional, interracial family. Except for maybe right inside Kentucky and Scott County, where there's still a lot of descendants floating around at that point. But nationally, this erasure has started to happen in terms of the larger narrative. But something else really sad happens internally in the family, right? The pressures of segregation, the violence and lynchings of Jim Crow, the one-drop rule, all of these things that come up after the Civil War starts to force descendants of the family across the color line, but not just across the color line. They begin to actually not pass down the story of their family's history to their children and their grandchildren. Because for a long time, the stories were passed down. But at some point in the early 20th century, they stop. They move to California, they move across the river to Ohio, they begin to move to Illinois, to Missouri, and they stop telling their children and grandchildren that we are descended from a vice president. Because if they did that, they would also have to mention that they were descended from a vice president and his Black wife. And they don't. And so the story is lost to the family. It's not only lost to the nation, it's lost to the family. It's not until the 1990s that there's recovery inside the family about who they really are and where they come from, right? And there's a lot of pain in that. There's discomfort, there's anger, there's hurt. There's people who didn't talk to me because they wished probably that I wasn't writing this book. But there's others who did talk to me, and there's varying levels of hurt and anger and frustration that they weren't told the truth. They didn't know about it, right, from the beginning. And these folks talk openly about it. But this, to me, is the danger point that we see. This is how we've come here. By hiding our heads in the sand, by refusing to face the truth of our history head on, by not talking about slavery, by not talking about interracial sex, by not talking about the violence of it, but also the complications of it, the families of it, the mixed race children of it, right? The messiness of it, because history isn't clean. It's not lined up into little boxes that you can check. When we don't deal with the messiness of it, when we try to erase and lie and burn and destroy, it forces, eventually you come to a confrontation point, and that's where I really feel like we are right now, right? We've come to this point here in 2023 where more and more folks are standing up and saying, we want to learn this, right? This generation of my students that I'm teaching, I've been at IU now, this is my 19th year on the faculty at IU. So it's a generation, we say 20 years is a generation. It's a generation of students that I've taught, and these students are saying, we're tired of being lied to. We're tired of being misdirected. We've never learned this, not even in our high schools, and we want to know the truth. We want to know about indigenous histories. We want to know about African American histories because it's first and foremost American history. You cannot know the full accounting of this nation's history without Black people, without indigenous people, without, I mean, that's, otherwise, what are you learning? What are you learning? It doesn't even make sense. It literally doesn't make sense. So more and more students, more and more young people are standing up to say that. But on the flip side, you have this incredible fear and pushback because ultimately it's about power, right? Because if you educate, if you teach, if people learn, then the fear is things will change, right? Power, right? How power is divided and assessed and held will change. We're hearing all over the country about how voting lines are being redrawn and redistricting is happening because gerrymandering has been such a problem for so many years in so many places. So in places like Alabama, new districts are being drawn. That terrifies people who have always held the power. Books like this are important because if we don't talk openly, we will continue down a path towards a place that I fear. To me, I said in the book, and I say it again, the only way that people talk about, well, we want peace, we want peace, we want peace, and I said, or justice, and I said, well, you can't have peace without first truth. Truth, then reconciliation, and then justice, and then peace. You can't skip over all of that and just have peace because it's a false peace. So we must have stories like Julia's. We must talk openly about the good, the bad, the painful, the ugly, because it's all of our histories. And only then do we get to the other side can we actually start to experience the healing. Until then, it's still a pus-filled wound that's waiting to be lanced.
Emma, did we have any time for a couple of audience?
Please.
Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please ask them.
Please, indulge us.
I actually have a couple of questions. And one thing that I find fascinating actually from the talk is in terms of erasing in history, it seems like Richard apparently touched the third rail in the United States. You know what I mean? He was like, he got too close, and being that close made him gets him ostracized, you know, in a very definitive way. Like not just him, but his descendants. And I find that sort of kind of fascinating. That it's sort of like almost like a cautionary, like don't do that. Like if you do it, you will get erased, and that's kind of interesting to me. But the other thing that I was wondering is, you speak of these people as if you know them. So I'm also kind of curious about that. Like you mentioned them, you talk about them by first name, and it's kind of interesting. Like, and I guess you've lived with them for 12 years or so. So how do you feel about them, about Richard and Julia and the daughters, and it just personally, not in terms of the book?
Okay, so what do you mean by feel about them?
Well, what I'm saying is that it's obvious that you also have like thoughts about them, like about the people, not just about the historical aspect of it.
Well, they were real people, of
Right.
course. I mean, this is not fiction, right? These were real people. They really lived and they really died. And I really talked to their descendants, some of them anyway, which is phenomenal and amazing. I mean, I try really hard. It's when you've spent so much time working on a project, I think it's inevitable that you become very close to your subjects. And they were real people, and I spent so much time going to Kentucky, spending large chunks of my summers living in Kentucky, doing research there, meeting local people, talking to them, meeting family members, interviewing them, walking the land where, like I said, having gone to Blue Spring Farm, having gone to Great Crossing Baptist Church, right? Having gone to these graveyards, seeing the one remaining building at Choctaw Academy. So the places that I talk about are places that I've been, right? And I've come to love bourbon, which I didn't like in the beginning. Out of self-defense, I've become a bourbon drinker. It's kind of like you have to if you're doing all this work in Kentucky. But I've really become very, like, I've come to know Kentucky in a way that I never did before at all. And really love so much about Kentucky. Like every other place in the country, it has its problems, right? But it also has its beauty and its charm in many ways. But the danger, of course, is I think that when we become too close to our subjects and we cross that line into trying to place emotions or thoughts or feelings upon them that we can't possibly know or ascertain. And I truly hope that I didn't cross that line in this book because, as I said, we don't have Julia's letters. We don't know how she felt about Richard. But there are, and I want to really want to make something clear. When you read this book, I talk about it like, I say it's like sunshine to shadows, this book. Because it starts out with much more lightness and hope than how it ends in some ways. And that's because you really see, as the story moves and it unpacks, that, just because Richard loves his daughters doesn't mean that he loves all Black people. He is an enslaver. He owns a 2,000-acre farm and he runs it with almost 100 enslaved laborers. Yes, he privileges Julia and her daughters and Julia's close kin, her brothers, her sisters, her nieces. But make no mistake, this is a man who works his farm with enslaved laborers, flogs those enslaved laborers when they misbehave, and sells them downriver when they cross the line and irritate him too much. And when he goes into debt, he mortgages them in order to get himself out of financial penury. This is a white man who's from the privileged classes, and in the South, that means what? He's a landowner and a slaveholder. And he never stops being those things. And that's why I said it's very reminiscent of people today who like to say, well, I met people in Kentucky who were like, oh, well, he loved her, he loved his daughters. I'm like, I think he did love his daughters. I have letters where it's very clear that he loved his daughters. But I don't know if he loved Julia. I think that he respected her abilities and her skills, because he talks about that in his letters and how she could run everything when he was away, and she could have access to his lines of credit, she could handle contracts. He respected her abilities. He knew her skills and talents. He needed her to do all of this, otherwise he could never be gone for 6 months every year. Did he love her? I don't know that he loved her. If he loved her, why didn't he ever free her? He never manumitted her. And I'll tell you something, in my opinion, I think it's because he deep down was afraid that if he did, she would bolt. It was the only thing keeping her there. She couldn't leave. So if it was really about choice, if it was really about consent, and it wasn't about coercion, why not set free the woman that you've been with for 23 years? He doesn't have a white wife. And according to local, even the newspapers who smeared him all the time, it said, they were like, he wasn't with anybody else until after she died. And they love to talk about him and the family in the newspapers. So I try not to am I emotionally invested in my project? Absolutely. They were real people. But I try not to place emotion on them in that way, because I think that's dangerous because that's not what a historian is supposed to do, then you get into the realm of novelists and fiction writers, and that's not what I am. I am still an archival historian, have been trained as one, and will always remain one. So I hope that gets to the heart of your question.
No, definitely.
Oh, good.
I have one more question. I come from the Dominican Republic. In the Dominican Republic, it's said that 85% of people are mixed lineage. And I mean, even my own family.
Spanish, indigenous, African. Yeah.
There's a lot of mixed.
I visited your homeland many times.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm curious now, because of this book and because of the story, how many Julia Chin are there in the United States?
I think there are so many other women just like Julia who lived and worked and, like I said, laughed and loved and labored and died in the 16, 17, and 1800s who we still don't know about. And in fact, I'm really hoping that books like this one will encourage people to do more research on women like Julia and families like hers and descendants like hers. Because what do we learn about privilege and about power and about sex and about marriage and about gender and patriarchy, right, and slavery through these kinds of books? I think is really important. I was just at an event that was hosted in Kentucky last month by, it's an organization called Echoes of Our Ancestors, and these are Black descendants of the family who organized this over Labor Day weekend. But more and more people are popping up, like they're taking those DNA tests, right, through Ancestry and other organizations. And because there are lots of descendants who have put their materials up on Ancestry and built family trees, when they match, they're getting pings, like they're getting messages like, hey, you now have a new fifth cousin, or whatever the case might be, right? And so that's happening. So, but it's really, there's the science part of it that's helping people figure this stuff out. But I think the historian has a really important role to play. The family genealogists have a really important role to play in finding these records, piecing them together, and telling the story of women like Julia and Imogene and Adeline and Parthene, and so many others whose stories have yet to be told. Because we know, like, Henry Clay had an enslaved Black mistress, right? He had a white wife, but he had an enslaved Black mistress, and he had several children with her. But see, he hid it in the quarters, he lied about it, he wasn't open about it, and his wife caught him in the act. She caught him with the woman in the quarters. And she of course, understandably, was very upset about it. She lost it. And so in order to keep the peace, what does Henry Clay do? He sells the woman and all their children downriver to Louisiana, gets rid of them to appease his wife. How many descendants of Henry Clay are there today running around the country who are Black, right? Who have Black lineage? So it's not, there are so many women whose stories deserve to be told because they're part of the larger US narrative. And there are lots. Yeah, I firmly believe that.
Time for one more. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm curious about the books you read, especially when you were trying to figure out how to do informed speculation. Because like the field of creative nonfiction does this as well. We do a lot of archival research, and I'm really interested in how some of their methods can also be used in informed speculation. So I was just curious about like what books you read or what method, where you learned how to build this world. And if there are other books you looked to for as examples.
Yeah. I've been talking to my students about informed speculation for like a long, really, really, really long time. Well over a decade. Some of my earliest graduate advisees would attest to that. And I think that other scholars call it different things. And one of the scholars that I would reference here, whose work I've read a lot of and who I respect enormously, is Saidiya Hartman, right? And Professor Hartman, right, she calls it critical fabulation, right? But it's about using the archive to the best of your ability, but then layering it with non-traditional sources outside of the archive, and also being willing to use fiction and other materials, and then filling in the space by placing yourself into, right, the era, into the context, and thinking about, well, when the archives end, when the secondary sources that are out there have filled in the gaps that you can, when you've extended outwards to use creative materials like music and poetry and fiction, when you've used ethnography and interviews, then can you place yourself in the moment and engage in that next step of imagining the world that your characters, that your people, right, lived in? And she does this really really wonderfully in Wayward Lives, right? And so that really, she talks about it earlier in Venus in Two Acts, but then she follows it up in Wayward Lives, where it's just so clear in the work that she's doing with the Black female subjects that she talks about. And so that to me is really was very inspirational, her work, because I mean, I'm not a fiction writer, but the way Professor Hartman writes, it's the best of bringing together deeply researched, archivally researched work, but written in that creative narrative style that is not academic and pedantic, right? And so to me, I think that that's really, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really just wonder, like, who inspired you to try and take this on? Because it's such a huge project in so many different ways. So thank you.
Yeah, and I've been reading Dr. Hartman's work for a long time. And I mean, certainly there are others who have inspired me in terms of thinking about the archive and the violence of the archive, right? Jennifer Morgan has done incredible work on thinking about the archive as a violent space and how to think outside of the traditional settler colonial archive. She did that in her first book, Laboring Women, but also very much so in her recent book, Reckoning with Race. Incredibly important books on how to think outside of, especially because Dr. Morgan's work is from a very early time period. She's looking at the era of the transatlantic trade, the rise of racial capitalism. So we're talking, right, 14, 15, 1600s, very early material when the fragments are even more fragmentary. So Marisa Fuentes, right, who's written a great book, Dispossessed Lives, which talks very directly about the violence of the archive. Nobody, at least no sane historian, writes a book in a vacuum, in isolation. And so there are just an incredible cadre of Black women historians and scholars whom I owe an incredible debt to, because they've paved the way for me to be able to even conceive of writing a book like this, because 20 or 30 years ago, I wouldn't have even attempted to write a book like this because they hadn't yet done that work. So they did that theoretical and methodological work that allowed me, right? The Tara Hunters, right, and others have done that work that have allowed, me to be able to do this one.
Professor Myers, it's an honor to hear you talk about your craft as a historian, and also to learn this story, which I don't think we would have otherwise known about. I told you that you're on your way to a feature movie that's in here. Not only is it a great book, but we can all say we knew her when. It was just a great book, right before the movie deal. But thank you so much for sharing this story with us and letting us watch you work.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Professor Clegg, and thank you all for being here. Thank you.
So this is the first of several things. that the
Yeah,
press has.
7 events in the next 5 weeks.
That's a good pace, isn't it?
Well, this was a good start.
Yes. Yeah.